Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And just like to welcome you to the Coeur d'Alene School District 271 Board Workshop for November 19th, 2019. Just before we get going, I'm going to introduce who's sitting up front here. And I'll start with my far right with Miss Lynn Town, our clerk of the board. And immediately next to me is Dr. Steve Cook, our superintendent. To my left is Lisa May, our vice chair. Tambra Pickford, board member. Miss Brumley is in the open spot there. Or she's not in the open spot there. She had work commitment this afternoon and may be joining us and may not be. And then our newest board member, Rebecca Smith, on the end. My name's Casey Morrisroe, and I'm our board chair. Okay, is there a motion to approve today's agenda?
So moved.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Aye, thank you. So just a couple things before I turn over to Dr. Cook here. In a few minutes, we'll hear from Dr. Cook, and we're going to hear from our consultants from Flow. And we're going to break this meeting into two parts, really. So the first part, we're going to have a presentation and be here at the dais and see the springboard options and kind of start the initial conversation that'll lead to the committee work. And then once we've completed that, we'll take a recess for 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll kind of reset around some tables, and we have really some housekeeping work that we need to do just around the boundary review committee. So if I don't remember that, someone remind me as we get to that part. A couple things I just want to say. So springboard is this springboard proposal is really just that. It's just to get us thinking and to kind of jumpstart the work of the attendance review committee. And I don't know all of the exact dates and times. I may mess it up a little bit, but we have a committee of about 40 people that'll be looking at our attendance zones, and they're going to meet 7 or 8 times. Is that right, Mr. Voller? Oh, good. Here comes Miss Brumley. Mm-hmm. And during that process, there will be a few points there where we'll have public meetings, and people will be able to view proposals and comment on those along the way. So, again, today's really just to kind of jumpstart the conversation and to allow us to look at things maybe in an outsider's view and how they look at it. So, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Cook, and let you get us started.
So first of all, thanks for coming. I'm excited for this day. We've had a lot of work going up to and leading into the beginning of this conversation, and I think that's the thing that I would like us to keep in mind as we begin this work today. Really, is to think back to all the components that have gone into this first kind of starting point. If you recall, we had a pretty comprehensive survey that we sent to parents. We got a tremendous return on investment for participation, almost 330 pages of comments from our community, a lot of great data points, 33% roughly of our constituents replied to us and gave us feedback. We provided a lot of demographic data and resource to Jed and his team, and they've taken that data along with the document we worked on together about the charge that we'd like to put before the committee and the guiding principles that kind of come from a discussion about what our values look like and those things that we want to kind of frame out. We gave that to Flow, and they've stripped this on the soapbox for a second. They've stripped some of the emotion out of it and just used cold hard math to kind of take first shot at this and created what you might call the springboard proposal, and now they're ready to release that to us to view, and then potentially to give to the committee to do the hard and heavy lifting of taking that and starting this conversation. So this is going to be a little maybe even a little messy today. I don't expect this to be perfect. I don't expect this to be exact. If it was, we wouldn't need to do anything else but approve it today. So I'm excited for the conversation our community is going to have going forward about this. And so I'm also excited to turn it over to Jed so that he can share with everybody here and you all the process that's gone into developing this kind of launch pad. So bear with us as we do this, and I'd like to introduce Jed Roberts from Flow Analytics.
All right, thank you so much, Superintendent Cook. Can you hear me all right? Is this picking up okay? The lapel mic? All right. Okay, well, I'm excited to be here, finally in front of the board. I did get an opportunity to meet with district staff a couple weeks ago, but this is a big day to actually show you some of the springboard options that we'll be looking at here. And as Superintendent Cook said, we want to select a single springboard option to begin the work for the review committee. We want to give them something to start with. So I also want to introduce Jenna Putnam as well here in the orange. Yep, she's had a big hand in helping develop the springboard proposal, and she'll be with me throughout the process here, helping to run the committee meetings as we get to that point, starting in December. So I'm just going to run through a slide deck now, and I think that you've got a printout of it. Please, I know you want to jump ahead and probably look at some of this stuff, but if we can just kind of go slide by slide together, I think that'd probably be the most productive here. So I just want to start with today's objectives, and we heard that we're going to sort of break this out into two sections here. With the larger group that we have right now, we're going to talk about the selection of a springboard proposal for the Boundary Review Committee. Then we're going to take a recess, and we're going to break into a smaller group, and we're going to really just talk about logistics, so we know exactly who's doing what for the committee meetings and how we'll be running those, which I believe will be happening here in this room. So that'll be more of a discussion with the board and the district staff. So just want to show you what we're looking at right now for geography of the district. The two main colors that you're seeing there are the high school attendance areas, and then you can see overlaid on that the orange lines are the elementary school boundaries, and there are some spots where they're coincident with the middle school boundaries, which are kind of right split between the center section of town right there. A little bit thicker lines. It's a little bit tough to see, but you can see a little bit better on your printout. So there's a zoom in here of really most of where we have the school, both locations and the attendance coming from here. So again, these are kind of colors that we will come back to again and again. The high schools are in your green, and that's kind of your thicker boundary there. Middle schools in blue, elementary's in yellow. And then we've got our magnet and alternative schools, Sorensen, Ramsey, and Venture, that are shown in the black color there. And again, just sort of the same themes with boundaries there. So you can see that there's not necessarily a feeder system going on. There's a lot of kind of overlap of different areas. And what you'll see once we get to the springboard here is we tried to, one of the things in addition to looking at capacities is to try and build a little bit of a feeder system as well. So I just wanted to show, the student density here within the district, obviously really centered in on that area that I was just zoomed in on. This area right here, Atlas, Skyway Elementaries, that's where not only are we seeing a lot of growth, but that's where we've actually got the most students currently in the district, with some, obviously some hot spots here and you'll see some additional development happening up in this area as well.
Jed, sorry to interrupt, and this might not be the right time to answer the question, but would you mind maybe elaborating on feeder system and what you mean by that? Just whenever it's appropriate for that.
Yeah, I think
just so we're all on the same page.
Yeah, I think that when we get to the actual maps, of the springboard. I think it'll make more sense to have an illustrative figure for you to look at there. So this is just a zoomed in map of that student density for more detail there if we need to refer back to this at any point. But again, really the west side is where we have most of the students coming from, as well as most of the new development. So an important part of the forecast work that we did up to this point is based on residential development that we're expecting in the district here. And we're really looking at two snapshots, two periods of time, really the first 5 years from now and then 5 to 10 years from now. So what you're looking at right here is just where we're expecting sort of the hot spots of development over the next 5 years. And then this next one here is more cumulative. This is over that entire 10-year time horizon that we'll be looking at for our enrollment forecasts. So probably not a lot of surprise here. You know, we know that there's a lot happening in this area here. There are some new subdivisions that you'll notice between 5-year and 10-year. These are more of a long-term development expectation. The way that we developed these maps here was getting in touch with planners at all the jurisdictions. So we had conversations with them. We got lists of all the known developments that are planned or in the offing. So this was a big research project to find out this information here, and is something that we need to spend a lot of time on to get our forecast. All right, so this is a slide that I just want to spend some time on and make sure that we, yeah, question.
Jed, can you go back to the 10-year development?
Yep.
That red spot in the bottom.
Yep.
Sorry. That red spot at the bottom.
Yeah.
Where is that?
That is just right around the lake.
So it's on the other side of the lake.
Yep. So
Is that like the Black Rock
here's
area?
I-90 going through here, and then, yeah, you just kind of come around the lake there.
That would be Gaza Ranch area.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Black Rock would be down the lower south side, or the west side.
By the Aspen Grange area.
Yep. Okay, this is an important slide because it really sets up kind of the philosophy of how we're looking at the modeling that we're doing. And so let's recall that we're doing a boundary review process right now. That's inherently a geographic problem. And so the way that we address that geographic problem, using the right tool to solve the right problem here, is that we're looking at residence-based modeling. And so what we're doing is looking at the number of students that are expected to reside inside a certain area. So the things that we can do to change that model are really things like reshaping the attendance areas themselves, or introducing or reducing more or less capacity for specific school locations. Now I want to contrast that with what I think a lot of people have in their mind, which is the attendance-based modeling, which is really specific to how many students are going to be in each building, with the understanding that there are specific school programs that are going on, usually special programs. And so these are things like the magnets, if there's dual enrollment, if there's pre-K. These are all things that lend themselves to what the actual attendance is going to be at a specific building. School choice, that's a major one. Out of district allowances. So it's really important to know that we're looking at two different things here. And the example that I want to give, in our residence-based modeling, are the two magnet schools, the elementary magnet schools of Sorensen and Ramsey. So what we're doing in our modeling is actually pulling out those numbers of students, because we know it's a known quantity. The district controls, what those attendance are, what those attendance numbers will be, based on your policy. And so when we're looking at attendance areas, we don't want to have our residence-based model thrown off by by students that are attending in areas that are non-attendance schools, essentially, non-attendance area schools. I should correct that by saying. So does that make sense what the difference is? All right, so to help me understand what your questions are sort of around the difference between these two models here.
I understand the difference between the two models. I wonder about maybe your interpretation of what our current policy is regarding magnet schools.
Okay.
Because Ramsey, for instance, is one of our largest elementary schools. And I would say most of those students that attend that school, and Trustee Brumley can probably speak to this better, live in an overlay. And so essentially it's an attendance zone, but it's called an overlay. So I'm seeing this, I have a little bit of heartburn because maybe we weren't clearly delineating to how we handle these schools. Sorensen's a little bit different because they have a overlay also that draws a fair number of students, but does that make sense maybe?
So you're saying that there actually is a geographic area where you would be eligible to go to Ramsey.
It gives them priority,
Gives them
basically, to the
priority.
seats. So people within that overlay,
Right.
which in Ramsey's instance is a portion of the Winton attendance zone, gives them kind of first dibs
Okay.
towards the seats.
Right.
And I think unfortunately, oh, sorry, go ahead. We don't have a clear policy on our magnet schools. And so going forward, it's something that I think we must work to clear up. But I would think there would some that would say, my student lives in the Ramsey attendance zone and not even really understanding what an overlay is per se.
Right.
So,
I guess I hadn't expected that they would be completely excluded from any of the boundary design. That was not what I understood. I thought that both Ramsey and Sorensen would potentially have their own boundary, but what discussion had been was it wouldn't be to maximum capacity of those schools, to remain for some options for other kids to come into those magnet. So it's similar to the overlay, but I really struggle pulling two, particularly one huge school out of that, and where you fill in the gaps then, and where, I mean, you're talking major busing issues if you're going to then have kids attending Ramsey or Sorensen in the capacity of 1,200 or 1,300 kids, and they're coming from everywhere. So that's my concern.
And maybe just to give a little more background, so in those overlay areas, excuse me, are really busing zones for us to some degrees, our transportation zones. So we provide transportation to those two magnet programs within the overlay. Sorensen's is fairly compact, so a lot of it's walking, so it falls outside of our busing. But there is one or two buses, I believe, that service Sorensen. One, thank you. Where Ramsey's 7 or 8, I think I heard last week. And this was a conversation that we had last week in a meeting that we had is, and I don't think we're there yet, obviously, is what do we do with those? Do we continue the overlay? Do we do something different? Is it a mixed model? And I know we have we're working on sometimes to get out to the schools, particularly Sorensen and Ramsey, just to have those conversations about, are they their own attendance zones? Are they some sort of hybrid? Are they status quo and they're an overlay?
Okay. So let me kind of walk through how that would affect our residence-based modeling. So, if we foresee a future in which the locations of students that currently go to those magnet schools are going to significantly change, then that presents an issue for our residence-based modeling. Because now the students that we're pulling out of the capacity numbers that we're looking at, they're now potentially coming from different attendance areas that we're not pulling them out of the right places anymore. Does that make sense? So what we do know about Sorensen and Ramsey is that for the most part, those students that are attending are generally close to those schools. And so as we pull those attendance numbers out of our residence-based model, those are the areas that are being affected, right? Now, again, if we foresee a future where that distribution is changing, we need to find a way to figure that into our residence-based model. So as we are looking at it, changing these attendance areas, we can account for that.
And I guess my question would be,
Yeah.
if we were to say, see some modeling using our current overlays, how dramatically different would your proposal look today?
If the students are mirroring a current, a distribution that looks like it does right now, it doesn't affect our resident-based model at all. If it changes, that will have an effect on that model. Does that make sense? Okay. So I just want to highlight this statement at the bottom here. It's really about, policy versus geography. And so, with the residence-based modeling, again, geographic problem, we're looking at changing the boundaries, increasing capacities, and those sorts of things. It's really a complementary thing to the policy decisions that are being made. But, the attendance areas, that is the foundation for the district and how we'll be deciding, who goes to what. Now, if there's a commitment really to getting that attendance area part right, what we have seen is that it leads to less complex policy that is really moving students around to make up for imbalances in attendance areas. So I just want to walk through the current attendance areas and some statistics on that. This is this format of table here is one that you're gonna see come back to. So I want to make sure that you understand how this is set up here. So these are elementary schools that we're looking at first here. These are all of the elementary schools that have a current very defined attendance area. This is relative to Ramsey and Sorensen. This is the capacity as defined with district staff and input from the board. And this is the count based on October 2019 numbers for each of those attendance areas. And here's where it's important to understand the footnote that, again, residence-based counts, these are not true enrollment. So I just want to mention that Nexa, that's the new location with new capacity on Prairie. So that's probably a higher number than you might expect with the current location. But as I was stating earlier, this excludes the magnet school attendance. It's going to exclude out-of-district students as well. And I just want to mention on the out-of-district for elementary school, that count for elementary school-wide is currently 38 students, and based on the forecasting conversations that we've had with district staff, that's something that we expect to drop down to about 21 students by 2029 based on the district policy. So that's the here and now, 2019. And here's capacity percentage, right? So this is just a simple comparison of capacity here to the count within those attendance areas and the over and under. So Atlas is an example, currently running at 117% of current capacity. Now here's where the forecasting that our firm comes into play for the 2024 and the 2029 scenarios here. This is where we're looking at not only the development that's expected to come online, but any additional infill in the existing neighborhoods and just more younger families coming to the area. So,
Wait, sorry to
yep.
interrupt. On those building capacities, and this might be for Mr. Voller, but Jeff, is that's permanent structure? That's not capacities including portables, is that correct? Okay.
Yep, portables are not included here.
Okay, thank you.
We'll talk about portables a little bit with the first springboard option. So you can see here what the forecasted attendance areas will be represented by as far as elementary age students, and then you can track how this is going to change over time. And so, some numbers jump out obviously Skyway, I think, is a known issue, and we see that continue, that trend continue going out 5 and 10 years. So I want to clue you in on the totals here for the 2024 over under and 2029. So this is what we're looking at for basically over capacity elementary school wide in 5 years, 175 students. And you can see that if we keep the attendance areas as they are, there's a wildly different distribution of students either over or under as we move through time. So Nexa at the new location, as an example, if we have that current Nexa attendance area, you're running at 272 students. You could fit 272 more in 5 years. And then going forward, 275. Versus on the other end of things, Skyway, 5 years out, you've got more than 310 students over your capacity, up to 500 over your capacity, which is really right around 500, hence the 200%. That number to me, 45, looks a little bit like the capacity of an entire school, and maybe that's something that we need to be thinking about going down the road. That's just a number that jumped out to me, and I thought I'd point that out. That is one way to, of course, handle some of these overages that we're seeing in capacity. So middle school, same type of table here. We're seeing really, the main trend here is Canfield. We see going down in capacity, or actually, attendance area. And then, obviously Woodland is the one that we're seeing quite a bit more, Lakes as well, really running over right now and continuing to do so. Here is your 10-year overcapacity number, 470. Now, compared to the capacity of a single middle school, it looks like about half. I think the question is, is 470 in 10 years something that is going to warrant an additional school? Is 270 in 5 years going to warrant an additional school? I mean, those are questions to try and think about here as we settle in on a springboard. And then finally, for existing attendance areas, the high school attendance. So, a little bit similar to Canfield. They cover a very similar geographic area. We've got Coeur d'Alene High School trending downward in attendance, and Lake City trending upward. Again, really similar overages district-wide to middle school. And again, looking at capacities of about 1,500 and an overage district-wide of about 500. Is that an additional high school type scenario? Probably not. All right, and I just want to focus on this a little bit. This is something that the committee is going to be looking at as we dig into sort of some of the guiding principles here, and I just wanted to show you some of these statistics for the current situation, the current scenario that we've got right now for attendance areas. So these are the percent of students within those attendance areas that qualify for free or reduced lunch. And what I've done here is I tallied up the spread here between the highest and lowest. So in this case, Bora with 64% eligible, and Dalton with 13.6%. I've seen this in other districts that we've worked with where they've really looked at it with an equity lens. This has been an area that they've wanted to focus on trying to reduce that spread. Now, typically that's going to be at odds with improving your capacities or maintaining community schools or transportation or. So that's just one of the things that the committee is going to be asked to balance there. Same with ethnic diversity. You see a spread of about 7.2% there. Obviously not nearly as pronounced as the free and reduced lunch. And then special education as well is a spread that we look at as we're thinking about those programs where we may need to shift resources in that regard. So that's elementary, and then here's that same table for middle school and high school. Didn't really need to highlight them because we just have a few to compare to see that spread. Lakes with the highest, with free and reduced, Canfield with the lowest. Similar here, similar there for ethnic diversity and special education. And then down to Coeur d'Alene versus Lake City. And you see this start to really come in quite a bit as the students filter up to the high schools. And that's really a symptom of geography, right? We know that the attendance areas for those elementary schools are smaller, so they're going to capture a little bit more of that fluctuation throughout the community.
Jed,
Yeah.
If you don't mind, before we get to the springboard option, if we could go back, I don't know, about 6 or 7 slides to the elementary school zone
This one right here?
chart there, yes. And I want to point out, maybe just for discussion on our part at some point, and maybe just to bring you in, but one problem with not having the magnet schools in here, and particularly Ramsey, which is our largest elementary school, there's about 180 kids in portables. And so if we were looking at their capacity, currently, it's that would add to that number on the right there as far as shortage.
Yes.
And so it creates a little bit of an issue, I guess, to not be looking at the full picture for me. And I just want to make sure we're paying attention to that, and that we realize that. I think we were saying, boy, that's maybe lower than we would have guessed.
Right.
But when you add in another 180 or 200 kids, you say, okay, yeah, 685.
Right.
It seems more plausible, I guess. But so.
Yeah, so we need to talk about how to frame that for the committee, if that's something that we want as sort of an a la carte number that they're just sort of carrying around about those magnet schools, or if there's a way in which we need to bring it into the geography of the residence-based model. Okay. So we've got 2 springboard options for you today that I'll walk through. The first is really focused on balancing the capacities in the near term. And I think for this to work, or something close to it to work after the committee has done their work, is probably going to need some kind of future relief from construction. I know that there's been talk of expansion or entirely new building, those sorts of things. That's probably something, as you see some of the overages for that 5 and 10 year that's going to need to be addressed. Now with Springboard Option 2, that really looked more at balancing capacities out into the mid and long term, really that 5 and 10 year. And I think that, there could be means with which, as you're looking at some of the overages there, that maybe portables are a way to go to address that. But it's really more of a temporary means to deal with some of those 5 and 10 year type situations if you're thinking that we're really starting to max out at what we're going to see in students over that period of time. So that's kind of the way to think about these two here. With both options, we are seeing some fairly significant changes to the boundaries, and having reviewed the community survey comments that we got, that was it was a recurring theme. We don't want to see our students going to a different school than they go to right now. So it's definitely something that we're aware of with this. But at the same time, as we were trying to balance these capacities, we weren't completely ignoring things like how are kids going to get to these schools? How walkable are they? Are we really breaking up communities in ways that don't make a lot of sense? So we did have that in our mind as we were developing these. And you had the question about the feeder system, and I'll show you what that looks like here. But that's something that we tried to establish where possible, where the numbers would work out here. So you guys with me? Yep. You ready? Okay. All right, so these are really small for the crowd. But I did kind of do the same thing here with the spreads of percentages here, just to show you what the school that's either most over or most under capacity looks like. And so these are the same tables that you've already seen, right? The existing boundaries. And so this is just that, putting into context those differences. So, for instance, right now we have, I believe it is Skyway for elementary is the top runner at 130% capacity, and then the new Nexa at 52%, hence that difference of 78%. So you see that moving into the future for elementary, a pretty broad spread in percentage point, 152 going out 10 years. A little bit more muted with middle school and a little more so with high school.
Jack, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So when we're looking at these numbers and we're looking at our elementary schools with our new capacities, where do we account for the students that are currently sitting in portable classrooms? And we know at an elementary school alone, it's roughly 300, and middle school, it's probably over 100. So how do we account for them on these spreadsheets, and when we're looking at these attendance zones, where do they fit into this mix?
Right. So because there are not portable capacities in here, they are going to be part of your over capacity. In those cases that schools with portables are running over capacity. So as an example, I know that Atlas does have portables, correct? And looking 10 years out in the springboard option here, it's still running at 158 over. That's 158 over without the portables. So if, for instance, the portables could fit 158 kids, you're in a situation where you're not necessarily overcrowding that. And so with this springboard option right here, that was actually taken into account for this near term. And really that's, again, where we focused in. You'll see that these spreads are going to be better than for springboard option 2. So where you see some of these that are going over, I know that with Skyway and Hayden Meadows, we know that they have portables. So if we're going to front load these capacities, those were the places where we tried to put that, knowing that portables do exist in those locations.
On the counts, that's existing enrollment, excluding some things, is that what you said earlier?
It's students within the attendance area. So elementary students within the attendance area.
I guess on this, my question, I'm looking at middle school. Because the Canfield one kind of just didn't look right to me. And so, like on our reports, we show Canfield currently has an enrollment of 864.
Okay.
But on here, we're showing 750-ish. And
is there some kind of, well, we have how many out of districts? We'll have some out of district students in there.
Yeah.
So that will be part of it. Is there any other special program there that's drawing in a way that's not an attendance area based approach for?
probably some sped because of life skills, but that's not going to be huge numbers. And there's probably some people who reside in Woodlands attendance zone that go there.
Okay, and they're able to choice in?
They're choicing
somehow?
in, yes.
Okay, that's going to be where those numbers are coming from. Yep.
So the choicing isn't accounted for in the attendance modeling.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Correct. So if there are figures on choicing, I mean, we do have the residence attendance matrix, right? So we can look at that. If there are significant choicing trends that we need to have the committee be aware of as they're looking at these capacities, and they can carry around, again, sort of on an a la carte way, we know that this is going on with Canfield, so we need to buffer a little bit in our minds when we're looking at that. We can prepare some materials that are available on the side to sort of deal with that, or we can try and deal with it in a more sophisticated way in the model, but we just need to have an agreement of how we're going to incorporate those students. And if we're going to assume that that's the policy going forward, that if we're choicing in that many students now as a percentage or as an absolute amount, that's what's going to happen continuing forward into 5-10 years as well. So,
Well, I think it's probably a mixture of some choice and some, hey, you're supposed to go to Woodland, but we're full, so you're going to go to Canfield.
Right.
So some forced choice.
gotcha.
Yeah,
But I think to look at, especially if we're talking 100 students potentially, or whatever the number is, it's a big number.
I think it's about
You'd
100
want,
students.
you'd want to look at that data, right? Because if they're all coming from, 70% are coming from this finite area, you may say, well, maybe that area should be part of Canfield's attendance zone.
So one of the documents, Jed, that you guys produced for us was the enrollment
Yep.
at a school,
Yep.
then the number of students that are in the attendance zone of that school,
Correct.
and the number of, and where those students that are choosing to go in or out of.
Yep.
And that was surprising to some extent.
Yeah.
It told a big story. And I think that's kind of some of the dialogue I'm hearing up here that would be
Yep.
something that we would want to consider
Yeah.
when we're moving forward is especially with the committee, is providing that information. Because of the uniqueness of the Ramsey-Winton relationship, it shows that Winton, I think, had 1,010 kids or something like that in the attendance zone, but 370-ish or so were leaving that attendance zone to attend Ramsey.
Right.
And that document captured so well that inter-elementary school migration patterns that we're
Right.
seeing, and I think have been in existence for some time due to the fact that we're, like, I think this year we've forced transfer somewhere around 40 kids, and I think last year it was about 60. And that's just because we are just tapped out. And so part of this is how do we know which ones of those are by nature of the community interest, and how much of those are we forcing upon to our community because of running this close to full?
Right. And importantly, how much is that trend going to change in 5 and 10 years? If it's not going to change, we're going to be okay with using these attendance areas because we're accounting for that. If it is going to change significantly, then we may miss the mark when we change a boundary and we find out that actually, no, there's going to be a bunch of kids in this area that now decide they want to go to Woodland or something like that. So yeah, that's what I'd be most worried about. So just to, again, this is the area that we focused in on with Springborn 1, really trying to minimize the differences in capacities in that initial year. And you see it start to creep up a little bit, and you'll really be able to contrast that with option 2. So I want to show you what this is looking like. This is district-wide. The colors are going to be a little bit difficult, but they are the elementary attendance areas. So Fernan, Winton, Bryan, Bora, Dalton, Hayden Meadows. There's Nexa here, Atlas, and Skyway. And I'm going to zoom in now to the area where all the schools are. And this is now on a satellite view here. So this gets to sort of the feeder thing that I was talking about, and I want to try and describe that here. So the blue lines that you're seeing over top of the colored areas, which are the elementary school attendance areas, are the borders for the middle school. And so in this case, you can follow this line here. Everything basically to the south of that is going to Lakes. The middle school and high school is coincident right here. You can barely see that. And so you've got this area basically to the east here, that is Canfield, basically all this area right here. And then this area here is all woodland. And then for the high school, that is coincident. Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite see that line. I think the middle school runs actually right there. Yes, sorry. This is where it's a little bit divergent. So see that Dalton and Skyway have a boundary that they share right there. That's a middle school boundary as well. So that's actually Canfield in this area right here. Sorry about that. So that's actually where this high school line is divergent from the middle school. But the rest of that, you see it really track with the boundaries. That's the only spot where those are divergent. So this is the high school boundary right here. Follow this line here. And it follows the elementary school break, except for in that location right there. And it all had to do with capacity. So that's probably a little bit easier to see in print form there. But that's the gist of what we're trying to accomplish with a feeder, right? So elementary students end up at the same middle school ends up at the same high school. And so I wanted to, and you can probably see a little bit better now the areas of the elementary school, but I wanted to show you that in comparison to the existing boundaries. Existing boundaries are black, and then you have the colored areas that are the springboard option. And so you see that there are some fairly big differences here. Note that there's a discontiguous attendance area for Bryan. This is Bryan right here. This is also Bryan right here. In the springboard, Bryan is just this single color right here. Bora is a fairly similar shape, but we see some fairly big differences across some of these areas here. Yep.
Jed,
Yeah.
we've failed, I think, as a district and as a board. If you look at the Dalton, that purple rectangle that's left of the black line,
Yep,
we call that the stovepipe.
the stovepipe, yeah.
And by not talking about Ramsey, I mean, it just makes that attendance zone completely wonky in my view. That it's
If we're expecting Ramsey's attendance geography to change dramatically from what it is right now. If it isn't, we're accounting for those students right now by taking them out. We're making sure that our capacities for these areas are not impacted by Ramsey because we know that they're tending to come out of these areas right here already. So,
But even Bryan we see is pushed, I mean, Bryan's is almost completely different than it is currently, and I think it's because we're not accounting for Ramsey and we're pushing Dalton across 95. So I kind of tend to agree that it would be helpful to incorporate Ramsey especially into this model so we can see it more accurately.
So the capacities that feed this area right here are only based on the students that live in that area, subtracting out any that go to any magnets. So we know that those students that choose to go to Ramsey or Sorensen, for instance, out of Dalton here, are not informing this decision on this boundary at all. Again, with the assumption that they're going to continue going around the roughly the same numbers of students from the same locations. So that's how we can have confidence that the attendance out of this area is going to look like what the capacities are that we're expecting. Does that make sense?
It does, but this is what I see in the future is I understand what you're saying, but kids that are currently at Ramsey are going to age out and their siblings are going to age out and new people are going to move into that Dalton area. Mm-hmm. They may or may not go to Ramsey. And so by setting an attendance zone that is that big, that would create a pocket of kids that are going to go there, I don't I agree with.
I mean, I would say that
I think
probably
we failed
80%
not
of the
getting
kids
Ramsey.
in the stovepipe go to Ramsey.
Right.
Of what's purple there, and the other 20 probably go to Winton because that's their option.
And I would say
And-
100 of Fernan go to Sorensen, so we've now made Fernan one of the largest attendance zones on there. Those kids are traveling an enormous distance to their new school. So I think we have done you a disservice in not quantifying what our expectation is for overlays.
Okay. So I'm going to flip here to the middle school option here. And so my understanding here, and I'm learning, I want to know if this is a good assumption here, but besides sort of the choicing that we have in some of maybe the forced transfers, attendance areas are really not as affected by magnets at the middle school level. Are attendance areas in this case going to have less of an impact from that sort of thing? Yeah. Okay. So, going back to Ramsey and Sorensen, I'm kind of thinking through this problem. Would it be possible to look at historical attendance information for those schools to see how that has changed over time?
No, I don't think it would be, because Sorensen was a failing school approximately 12 to 13 years ago, so their population was contracting such that it was going to be closed, and so that's why it became a magnet school. Ramsey was 5 years maybe after that, and they switched to a magnet school. So Ramsey's might be a little more historically relevant, but I don't know.
I think in the recent term, Sorensen would be, right? I mean, in the last 10 years. Anything longer than 10 years wouldn't be accurate anyways for any of our schools.
And I think Ramsey, you're going to see more. It's just going to really, I think it's going to be highly based on the attendance zone and the overlay there. That what you're going to see. And there are some kids that may travel there from different places, but I don't know how helpful that's going to be.
Okay. So if we were just, let me try and work through a little bit of this, because I feel like this is going to be a sticking point that we've absolutely got to work through before we get to committee work here. Do you envision a springboard in which we actually have an attendance area for either of those two schools that excludes attendance in these other elementary schools, if we go back to that? Could you envision a map here where we have an entirely new attendance zone for Ramsey that now displaces the attendance zones for those other schools there?
I'll speak for me personally. I mean, I think that's the question we need to answer. And so I guess my expectation of coming into today or into the committee work is that, yes, they were going to see, here's what it'd look like if you had 11 attendance zones. Or here's what it would look like if you kept 9 attendance zones and 2 overlays.
Yeah.
That's what I envision. And then, I don't think we're at the point where we could say we want to do 11 or we need to do 10, because we need to talk with those schools more and with our community more about that. And I think that was, sort of a light bulb moment for us last week that, wow, we got to answer this question. But don't feel we have the knowledge to answer that. As 5 trustees without first engaging those school communities. And that's why last week we said, okay, we need to schedule some time before Christmas to get into those schools and have some workshop sessions at those schools.
Okay.
And really before you guys begin your committee work, which is
December.
Right,
Yeah.
so well
Early
before
December,
Christmas,
yeah.
I would agree with Casey. I think my expectation too is that we would, I know very specifically one of the guiding principles that we talked as far as the committee would be is to evaluate both boundaries for those schools, Sorensen and Magnet, and Sorensen and Ramsey, and what it would look like. I don't think we ever thought not including them in any of it. It was an overlay concept or a border, very clear boundary
Or an attendance
concept.
area.
Not having them here today is frankly surprising. And
Okay.
so it's been trying to process the information with 1,000 children missing from the data
Yeah.
has been hard for me to process today.
Okay. All right. Well, that's really helpful feedback. Really, all we need to get going on that is a new line item for those with a capacity. And we can start, we know where they are, and we can start to basically push these lines around here to make those capacities work as well.
Can we ask you, in your experience, have you attendance zoned using overlays in the past, and is it successful or just?
So we have worked with lots of districts that have special programs that we call them non-attendance programs, non-attendance area programs. And so that is the way that we approach them in our model, is to take them out, assuming that there's not any major policy change that's going to be on the horizon that we need to account for, that the geography of those students and number or proportion is going to be relatively stable going forward. That's usually the way that we move forward. Now, if we know that there's something different on the horizon, a big policy change, we will incorporate that into our model in some way. For instance, reducing by some proportion a certain elementary school's attendance area. We'll just add students in artificially or that sort of thing with an assumption that this is because of this policy that's, this overlay policy, as we're calling it here.
Because if we were to understand this correctly, I want to make sure I'm tracking it right.
Yeah.
With the current proposal that you have, students attending Ramsey and students attending Sorensen, how would they access entry into those said schools? Would it be through a choice program, and so every year they would register and either be a lottery that's set up or whatever we had decided currently as a district to allow entrance into those specific schools?
Yep, that's exactly how it's treated here. It's a choice in with the assumption that it is the district that controls the capacity at those schools, and therefore it is a known policy quantity for the number of students
Yeah,
that are
and I
at
think
that.
where we failed you is that we didn't clearly explain how our overlays work, and they are essentially a choice in, but preference is given to those students who live in these overlays. And so, for instance, at Ramsey, like Trustee Brumley was saying, I would say, for the most part, that school is filled with students living in that overlay. Sorensen's a little bit different because they filled up so quickly, 11 years ago with kids who came out of zone. Now the downtown is booming, and so they're filling up just within their probably walking zone, giving preference to siblings and teachers, et cetera.
Right.
So it's a little bit different story, but there is preference given to those students who are living essentially in an attendance zone, but we're calling it an overlay zone.
Okay. So what we could do is something like, if we know that currently in that overlay zone, you're getting, I'm just making a number up, 40% choicing in to that school, that's something that we could build into the model if we're going to assume that 40% is the number going forward. Or we could say it's 40% in 2019, 55% in 2024. We could change those numbers, but it needs to be informed by the district staff or the board as to what's a realistic number going forward based on policy. So, are we getting somewhere on this? Yes. I feel like we are. Okay. All right. In the interest of time here, I think I should probably, we're already at an hour here, so I want to motor through the next springboard option here. And so I want to flip back to springboard option 1 to really show you the big differences here, which are the spreads in percentages here of capacities are a bit tighter here for springboard option 2 than they are for 1. And obviously you can look back to how they compare to the current situation if we were to let those attendance areas exist on as they are. So going back, you can see that these are a little bit higher numbers on the 2029 timeframe and 2024 timeframe for spreads between those. So we tried to smooth that capacity disparity out. So that's what that looks like there. So we're, 40% is the top that we're seeing, 40% spread between elementary schools there. All right, and so this is what this looks like district-wide. It's going to be a little bit different in a few areas here that I'll show you. So we're zoomed in on the core area of the district. This is Fernan. You can see in a little bit darker red here. This is Bryan here. This is Bora, Dalton, Hayden Meadows, Nexa, which has a little bit of a funky boundary there to help out with some of the development that we're seeing there with Atlas. Here's Atlas. It's got this little block here to help with some capacity issues. And then here's Skyway here, and then the rest, Winton. And so, again, with the feeder concept here, follow the blue line for your break in middle schools. So you've got everything south here going to Lakes. You've got everything basically northeast here going to Canfield. Note the only break here in middle school feeder is with Nexa. You'd have kids in the western part of Nexa feeding to Woodland, and kids basically, I believe that, yeah, on this section, on this side here going to Canfield. High school, on the other hand, is broken along those elementary school lines completely. So these Nexa students here would rejoin to go to Lake City at high school. So
they would, 10% of them, based on geography, let's just say,
yeah,
would go to Canfield, and then that 10% would come back to Lake City.
yep. Yeah, so that's a feeder challenge, right? So if you want to deal with the capacity for the middle school, that break is necessary. If the priority is to maintain that feeder and have the middle school boundary drag over here a little bit more, that's going to be an issue for capacity with Canfield. So it's just sort of a trade-off.
I guess,
Yeah.
so in this option, I think if we looked at elementary schools, like Hayden Meadows has some of our greatest capacity currently, the way they're laid out currently.
Yep.
But their attendance on shrinking from what I can see there. And so that doesn't, I guess, make a lot of sense to me. I don't understand why that is.
So there is projected, as we go back here,
That 10-year growth.
Right.
Right.
Yep, so Hayden right here, 400, it's really that 10-year where there's a development up in that area that's expected to come online in that 5 to 10-year range that's supposed to kick that numbers up, or those numbers up right there. So that's where that's in this springboard option why it looks the way that it does versus the option where we're focusing more on the front end balancing. If that makes sense.
How about, I guess what confuses me with all these proposals, or these two proposals, is one of our guiding principles, and it was towards the top of the list, was impact the fewest number of families. And some of these, like high school, looks to me like it impacts 70% potentially.
Right.
And so I don't see how that's following that principle at all.
It absolutely isn't, and we make no claims to do so. This is really about capacity and making capacity work first. Next, the feeder system, and then from there, maintaining communities for the elementary, maintaining walkability for the elementaries. But yeah, I think that there are some big swings with the way that the high school is in particular. We could choose different boundaries to try and align to improve sort of the existing situation, but you're going to, again, be balancing the capacity issue with that. So, and that's going to be right at, front and center with the committee. They're going to be dealing with that, trying to maintain the current boundaries and dealing with the capacity issues. So.
Would it be possible on the next time we meet is to attach, with these proposals or options, the percent of the student population that's affected?
Yeah.
I think that would be really important because I see some elementaries where 100% of these communities will be affected. And reading that survey and all of the comments,
Yes.
that is what our community was telling us they did not want to do. So,
Absolutely. Yep.
That spreadsheet that we were presented to the long-range planning committee and Dr. Cook referenced that showed the current zones and the amount of students transferring to other schools, it's the same one he's talking about. I think
Yep.
it just might be good to consider how many families are currently affected by the imbalance that the zoning is. So that slide showed it really well. That I think we're talking about families being affected by this, but a ton of families, mine included, are really affected by the imbalance that we have right now. So that slide showed it really well of how many, like Winton had over 1,000 in their zone, and how many we're currently transferring out is an effect of the current system that they're trying to accommodate a fix for. And I guess we're talking about, it looks like a lot right here and it's kind of overwhelming, but that really illustrated it well. And I don't know if you have that slide you could pull up because I think it would clarify some of this conversation. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's the attendance residence matrix is what we call that. And yeah, that shows the transfer out, transfer in. I don't have that in this particular one, but
Yeah, I'm going to ask that we not pull that up today
Okay.
just because of
Yeah.
the work we need to get done. But
yeah,
certainly that's something that the committee needs to have access
Right.
to and have readily available
good.
as they go.
Okay. So just to kind of finish this out here, yeah, we're seeing some pretty drastic differences between the existing, as you're noticing here, between the existing and what would make the capacities work better in the long term here. And really just, it's a function of where some of these schools are and just where the development's going to be in the future here. That's really all it comes down to. And then, here's a similar map here for middle school. A little bit less drastic change here, but still some in the core here nonetheless, moving mainly to lakes in a lot of cases there, at least on the west side. And then with high school here, you see, this is the existing one we've got. This takes more of a north-south approach here. So that's obviously, a big difference for, some of these areas down here that would be now going to Coeur d'Alene instead of lakes. So again, another thing that the committee is going to have to balance here as far as how to maintain that, perhaps based on a feeder with the middle school or perhaps based on the elementary school or some kind of combination. So that's the end of the springboard options here. And I just wanted to point out one other activity that we went through along with developing our enrollment forecast, and that was to do a site suitability assessment for potential new facility locations. And so this is a map that's just broken up into two pieces here, but ultimately what it's showing is what are the sites that are large enough to meet the needs for an elementary school of at least 10 contiguous acres, for a middle school of at least 20 acres, and a high school of at least 40 acres. And then there are some overlays here to say, here are parcels or sites that are already owned by the district. Here are some that the district is sort of targeting that may or may not have meet the criteria that develop these candidate sites. And here are some sites that, in this case, you're seeing this kind of crosshatch overlay. And you'll see that on a few of these sites here that are big enough for high school. Those are sites where there's either some known development. In this case, that's Forest Service land, so maybe not as likely as of a target, to to get it from the feds in that case. But down in here, we know that there are some developments occurring, even though they haven't yet, so we wanted to highlight that. And some of these other sites that, even though in the assessor data, there wasn't really a lot of high value on those sites, we know that, for instance, there's a park there. And so we've pointed that out. And then I can go to the bottom side of it here. And we've talked about these areas here with the district staff. Yeah, it'd be nice to have a bridge across here to really access some more of those areas there. Or we know that these are some more or less rugged areas where there's probably enough buildable land that you could cobble together, but access is really going to be an issue, and proximity to students. So, that's all something that needs to be thought about, these areas out here. This is an area that's been targeted. There are definitely some sites here. This is, I think, formerly owned by Anderson Farm, right? Armstrong, yeah. They are within an area that's really close to the boundary. That's something that we tend to avoid when we do these siting analysis, because we want to leave some room to the inside, but just because of the nature of the geography here of the district, that's really probably an area that's going to need to be looked at. And then, of course, there's this parcel here that's already owned by the district that is in an area that's going to see a lot of growth, but again, right on that boundary. So this could all go into any kind of situation that we might want to look at where we're considering an additional facility to be part of the springboard option going forward. But we need to figure that out really quickly. So with that, that's the end of the presentation that I've got here for you folks this afternoon. So thank you for your attention and for working through some of that confusing stuff on the overlays. I know it's not really straightforward. It is a difficult thing to kind of conceptualize, so thank you.
Before we recess, I guess I want to kind of, looking at today's objectives at the start, you said you wanted us to select a springboard proposal, and I'm assuming based on the feedback, we're not going to do that at this point.
Yep.
Because I think we've got some work to do on our end to probably help you do your work on your end. So, okay, I just wanted to make sure we weren't looking to do that.
So let me give you a little feedback on just, kind of timing of where we're going to be with the committee. So in order to, make the deadline of March 18th to give this body a recommendation, we're starting on December 3rd with the committee. That first meeting is really more to go over things like the residence attendance matrix, the enrollment forecasting, where we're going to see development, just orient them as to what's going on with the district and the student enrollment. We're not at that point unveiling the springboard. It's really more background information. On the December 10th meeting, that's where we would walk them through the springboard and actually start to workshop some potential different scenarios to improve upon that springboard. So that's the process that we've got right now in place to meet that deadline that we set out at the beginning of the project here.
What I would suggest that we look to do, if at all possible, is to hold this session again that week of December 3rd, and maybe look at a kind of a springboard proposal with the additional data that we need to pull together and information. So then you could have that for September 10th with the committee.
September 10th?
Or December, sorry.
Yeah, okay. To start with the committee.
Yeah, right.
To start with the committee on
But,
December.
on the 3rd, you could still do your background information with them.
Yeah.
Maybe earlier that day or later that day, we meet
Yeah.
as a board with admin and Flo, and kind of look at a new variation of the springboard proposals.
Yeah.
I think in the 2 weeks, then we are meeting with, reaching out to Sorensen and Ramsey and those communities and talking to them about the overlay and how it affects their community, and then really dialing in how those overlays affect magnet schools and if they're relevant anymore or.
Well, and I think what we can do, because that's a lot, right? We got Thanksgiving in the next 2 weeks also, so maybe a challenge. And so
Yeah.
what I would suggest, if we can't do that, is that going into December 10th, we maybe have models that show it both ways, and we try to have that conversation, in the month of December. And, and so we, as it goes along, we'll get a clearer and clearer vision of where we're heading.
But I'm hearing him saying that he wants us to have a proposal that you can bring to your committee on December 10th. So not multiple.
That's really important because the committee will be looking for, a single set of guiding principles and a path forward. If there are multiple maps in front with uncertainty about which direction and where to spend the time, that will be frustrating.
I wonder about the idea of a proposed, one of the things we could work with them on is look back historically at recent history on percentage of attendees for overlays and try to model out something as a starting point to use that as a baseline for this first version and use that as the kind of launch pad or potential first springboard. It wouldn't take us too long to look at the last 4 to 5 years of just what that would look like for a little bit of trend data and then try to map out some kind of an attendance correlation to that info. It's going to be, I don't know, I'm looking at Jay because he's going to be the one that has to do all that work. I think the more we want to try to accomplish, the more it may be that we have to slow this thing down and we can't meet the March deadline. And that's potentially scary as well, but we also don't want to mess this up.
I think we have some work to clear up still, understanding these overlays and how they pertain to our attendance zones, because I think they are two different animals between Ramsey and Sorensen, perhaps. And I think the information that you're looking to obtain would be helpful. But I think we still have some groundwork to do on what is the policy regarding our magnet schools and overlays, and really looking at that and being clear on all parts what it says, because it's even difficult to find. And I think that's maybe where the confusion stemmed from, is that we're all on different pages about the relevance of these overlays to attendance zones.
I like your idea, Dr. Cook, in looking at some of the data for the last 4 or 5 years, because what I could envision is if there's a trend of, I'll use Ramsey, of 730-ish kids, but only 500 of them are falling within a close proximity attendance zone, creating, this is what I'm envisioning, and maybe I'm totally wrong, Jed, and you can correct me, but you could create an attendance zone that would accommodate then that 500, knowing that we have this extra capacity to meet needs of people who choice in. So we're kind of doing what we've been doing already. If that exists and that trend data exists and that could be built, that seems to me to be at least information that would be really good for us to have and could help guide that. So I would agree with the direction Dr. Cook's headed.
And it might be different for each school, based upon percentages of students that are near, right?
I think we're still confused, though, on the overlays, in my opinion, that there are students now in our district who live in an overlay who cannot get into the school that they perceive to be nearest them. And so we have a procedure, I think, that's kind of loose as far as, if you live in this overlay, which school do you go to? Sorensen has several overlays, for instance, and depending on where you live, your overlay might be Winton, your overlay might be Fernand, and your overlay might be Bryan. So overlays, I think, in the understanding and how they pertain to attendance zone, that's something completely different. We're saying that Ramsey now would have its own attendance zone, and if you live within that perimeter, you're guaranteed access to the school. What we have now is a system that says if you live in that overlay, we will do our best to accommodate you, but we can't necessarily do that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so I think that needs to be cleared up before we let the community get to work on this, because otherwise it's just too many questions going forward about what does the overlay guarantee me? Is it access to the school that they are demonstrating or showing, or is it just hopeful entrance after I put my name in the lottery in the first entry period and the second entry period? There's just too much gray area for me to feel confident in giving the community a springboard proposal until we clear those items up.
I think we've got to be cautious because I worry about defining, anytime you talk about policy work, we're talking about a minimum of 60 days. 30 days to develop policy, 30 days for it to float in front of the public. And if we put that as a priority before we're going to make some decisions, that means 60 days before a committee could do any work puts us at starting the committee work in January.
I don't think there's policy pertaining to that. That's what I think the confusion is that there are guidelines that schools follow, and we have someone here that could probably speak to those guidelines, but they're cloudy at best. I'm afraid unless we clear up the guidelines, it's difficult.
Why don't we go ahead and pull the policy, because there is policy. I've seen it, and then we can go from there. I think. I agree with Jen saying I think the overlay probably works better for Sorensen because we're talking a smaller area. It's geographically a small area. One of the issues I have with the Ramsey overlay is the stovepipe area. Like I said, probably 80% of those kids go to Ramsey. But for the 20% who don't, they go to Winton and they ride a school bus for an hour each way. And I'm sure that's not their preference, but that's the way it works out. They don't get in there. And so I think Ramsey, because of the magnitude of it, the size of the school, it's probably easier to develop, like you said, some sort of attendance zone that maybe doesn't chew up all the seats, but a majority of them. That's kind of how it's coming already.
Yeah, let us see what we can find data that would support. I don't know that we can't do what you're asking. I just don't know if we can do all of that before we get started on this conversation. And I think let us pull some data and see if we can come up with something that gives us some semblance of what the trend looks like. And that might inform this tremendously. And it may not. And if it doesn't, then we have to have another plan to start this. But I think it's important at this point not to delay the conversations. So.
You could also, if there's a change in that policy of overlay and what that means, or you could phase it over years. The overlay or the policy around it could change over time, right? Because you wouldn't change it next year and all of a sudden everyone who's in those schools is now out of those schools, right? I mean, you would, there's a way you could phase that. Potentially. Okay. Why don't we take a 5 or so minute recess here? Okay.